In this video, we'll be going over the class knowledge base. We'll be talking about why you may want to use a class knowledge base, how to use a class knowledge base, and some caution when using a class knowledge base. So first, why would you want to use a class knowledge base? Well, before we can do that, let's take a step back and look at how CRH loads in knowledge bases. As you can see from this diagram, CR first loads in the application, then the platform, then ONS, then acquisition category, then standard, and then class. And what's important to note about this order is that the lower level knowledge bases will actually override any of the above knowledge bases. So for instance, when we look at the application, we can see that the application sets a number of parameters. However, once the platform is set, it will actually override some of those parameters. If we skip down to standard, standard will further override any of the above knowledge bases. So as you could probably guess, the class will actually override all knowledge bases. So why would you want to set that? Well, you may want to set that is if you notice that the CRH model does not adequately represent your team by default. CRH's parameters are based off industry average. However, your team may be doing things different than how the industry average does. So for instance, if you have a team that is very experienced in developing transponders, you may notice that the development environment parameters do not adequately represent your team. Without a class, you will have to set those parameters every single time you run a model. However, with a class, you can actually create a knowledge base that presets those parameters without you having to touch them every time. So this brings us to the second point, which is how do you create a class knowledge base? Well, to do that, let's open up CR. Now, from the CR opening window, we're going to want to go to what's known as the maintain knowledge base. If you're using CR 7.4, you're going to do that by clicking on Advanced and going to the left and clicking on this maintain knowledge bases. If you're using CR 7.3, you're going to do that by clicking on Tools and then going to the second line, maintain knowledge bases. From this point on, CR 7.3 and CR 7.4 have identical steps for creating a class knowledge base. So even though I will be continuing with 7.4, if you're still using 7.3, you can follow along and reach the same accomplishment. So let's click on Maintain Knowledge Bases. When we click on Maintain Knowledge Base, you'll notice that in this window, it actually shows all the currently existing knowledge bases. On the left side, you'll see four main options. You'll see an option to add a knowledge base, to edit any of the pre-existing knowledge bases, to rename any of the pre-existing knowledge bases, or to delete any of the pre-existing knowledge base. We are actually, for this case, we're going to want to add a knowledge base because we're creating a brand new class. Once we hit add, we're going to get to this create and modify work element. So let's create a knowledge base using that same example of the transponder, where you have a team that's just very efficient at making transponders. So the first thing you want to do, just to keep track of what you're doing, is you're going to want to name it. So we'll just name it transponder class. After that, you're going to actually have to select the element type that this class will work for. If you create a class for mechanical, it won't work for electronics or roll-ups. Also, if you create a class for roll-ups, it won't work for electronics or mechanical. So since we're making a class that's supposed to represent your team's efficiency with making transponders, we should select the electronic type. Now, in addition to that, if you want a starting point for adjusting the model, you can actually set any of these knowledge bases to have it so you have a starting point of the parameter that you're going to be adjusting. For this purpose, we're going to leave those blank, but I'll show you what it looks like and I'll explain to you how it would be different. So let's hit OK. It now opens up the model, and what you'll notice is on the left side, you'll see something that very much so resembles that electronic element. For the parameter, however, what you'll notice is everything is 0 or stars. If we had set those knowledge bases from the beginning, these would be set to whatever those settings would normally be. Since we left them blank, we're starting from stars, which means that we're starting from a blank slate and we can change it however we like. So we're going to go down to the development environment because again, we're saying that our team is more efficient than what the industry standard is. We're going to double click on the developer capability and experience. And while this is not advised, for practice purposes, we're just going to raise it to very high just so it's easier to compare to the model later. We'll hit across the board and OK. We'll do the same with development tools and practices. We'll make it to very high, across the board, and OK. And that's it. We've actually set the parameters of this new knowledge base. The only thing we need to do now is save this knowledge base. So we're going to go to the Save button. And there are 3 things you need to do in this window. First, you need to name this class. So we'll keep with our name. We'll call this the transponder class. From here, we need to tell how to save this knowledge base. Now we have a couple different options. We can save it as a class Kbase, we can save it as application Kbase, platform, operation support, acquisition category, or standard. Since we are looking at the class Kbase, we want to make sure we save it as a class Kbase. The last thing we need to do is we need to make sure this is being saved in the knowledge base repository. Now currently it is. However, let's hypothetically say it wasn't. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go to our documents folder. So we'll go to documents. We'll click on the SEER folder. We'll click on the SEER model we're using. In this example, we're using 7.4. And then finally, we'll click on Kbase. Now we are in the SEER-H Kbase repository, and we can save it, and it'll actually keep this new knowledge base that we saved. Alright, we are now going to open up a brand new model. So let's say new. And we're just going to do just an example to show what it looks like. So we'll call this example. We'll just arbitrarily set this to air manned. We'll set this to build to print just because again we're supposed to be efficient when making these transponders, and we'll set it to military full. We're not going to set the class because I want to show you what it looks like to have it set and not set. So now we'll put in 2 elements. The first one, we'll do a transponder. We'll set the class, and for name, we'll say with class. For the second one, we'll select transponder again, but this time we're not going to set the class. So we'll say without class. We'll hit OK. These 2 elements are nearly identical. The biggest difference being the fact that one has a class setting, the other one does not. So if we go to the development environment, you'll notice for the one with the class, it's set to that very high that we had defined in that maintain knowledge base section. However, when we go to the one without the class, you can see that it's set to that industry average. So by setting that class, we can now tell SEER-H to default to a new development environment setting. And this will save you time in running the model because you now don't have to go to those parameters and set them by hand. So now we need to talk about caution when using this. As you can see, the class knowledge base is pretty powerful. It will override anything that the SEER-H model previously had as a default. So when using it, you don't want to make this the rule, you want to make it the exception. You should really only be using the class knowledge base when you have data to back it up. If you've used the model on a number of your historical projects and you've noticed that SEER-H just falls a little short of what historical costs are actually, then you may want a class that helps to refine the model to better represent your projects. However, you really shouldn't be using the class without that background data. Additionally, you do want to be very careful as to how many parameters you're touching. If you're changing every parameter, then the previous knowledge bases are essentially useless because they are no longer setting the model to an industry average. It's always going to default to whatever you set. So be careful when using the class knowledge base. And that brings us to the end to our overview of the class knowledge base. We hope you found this helpful.